Bashar al-Assad was born on September 11, 1965 in Damascus, Syria. He is a Syrian dynast who succeeded his father, Hafez al-Assad, as president of Syria in 2000 and served until 2024 when he was toppled after 13 years of civil war. His fall came in spite of early hopes that his presidency would usher in an era of democratic reform and economic revival. Assad largely continued his father's authoritarian methods, and his attempt to repress the uprising against his rule included brutal tactics, most infamously the use of chemical weapons. Bashar al-Assad was the third child of Hafez al-Assad, a Syrian military officer and member of the Ba'ath Party, who in 1971 ascended to the presidency via a coup. The Assad family belonged to the Syrian Alawite minority, a small sect of Islam that traditionally constitutes about 10% of the Syrian population and has played a dominant role in Syrian politics since the 1960s. Bashar received his early education in Damascus and studied medicine at the University of Damascus, graduating as an ophthalmologist in 1988. He then served as an army doctor at the Damascus Military Hospital and in 1992 moved to London to continue his studies. In 1994, his older brother, Basil, who had been designated his father's heir apparent, was killed in an automobile accident. Bashar, despite his lack of military and political experience, was called back to Syria, where he was groomed to take his brother's place. To bolster his standing with the country's powerful military and intelligence agencies, he trained at a military academy and eventually gained the rank of colonel in the Allied Republican Guard. Hafez al-Assad also sought to engineer a positive public image for his son, who had lived out of the public eye. Bashar was placed at the head of a popular anti-corruption campaign that resulted in the removal of several officials that ignored the dealings of senior members of the regime. His image as a modernizer was tarnished by his appointment as chairman of the Syrian Computer Society. Hafez al-Assad died on June 10, 2000. Hours after his death, the national legislature approved a constitutional amendment lowering the minimum age for the president from 40 to 34, Bashar al-Assad's age at the time. On June 18, Assad was appointed Secretary General of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and 2 days later the party Congress nominated him as its candidate for the presidency. The national legislature approved the nomination. On 10 July, unopposed, Assad was elected to a 7-year term. Although many Syrians objected to the transfer of power from father to son, Bashar's ascent engendered some optimism both in Syria and abroad. His youth, education, and exposure to the West seemed to offer the possibility of a departure from what had been the status quo, an authoritarian state policed by a network of powerful overlapping security and intelligence agencies, and a stagnant state-run economy reliant on shrinking oil reserves. In his inaugural speech, Assad affirms his commitment to economic liberalization and vowed to carry out some political reform, but he rejected Western-style democracy as an appropriate model for Syrian politics. Assad announced he would not support policies that might threaten the dominance of the Ba'ath Party, but he slightly loosened government restrictions on freedom of expression and the press and released several hundred political prisoners. Those early gestures contributed to a brief period of relative openness dubbed the Damascus Spring. by some observers, in which public political discussion forums emerged and calls for political reform were tolerated. Within months, however, Assad's regime changed course, using threats and arrests to extinguish pro-reform activism. Afterward, Assad emphasized that economic reforms would have to precede political reforms. By 2005, Assad had used a series of cabinet reorganizations and forced retirements to sideline members of the old guard. Powerful government and military officials held over from his father's administration. They were replaced by younger officials, and many of the most powerful security positions went to relatives of Assad. However, even after his consolidation of Assad's power, his reform initiatives remained tentative and largely cosmetic. Economic liberalization mainly benefited a politically connected elite without helping the many Syrians who depended on the faltering public sector for employment, services, and subsidies. In 2007, Assad was elected by a nearly unanimous majority to a second term as president through elections generally received by critics and opponents as a sham. In his second term, Assad took some tentative steps toward ending his country's international isolation, seeking to mend relationships with regional powers including Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Assad maintained his father's hard-line stance in Syria's decades-long conflict with Israel, continuing to demand the return of the Golan Heights and giving support to the Palestinian and Lebanese militant groups Hamas and Hezbollah. Relations with the United States worsened after Assad denounced the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Nationalist and anti-Western rhetoric soon became a standard part of Assad's speeches. Assad was a key component in Iran's axis of resistance, allowing Iranian military forces to operate virtually unimpeded from Iran to Lebanon. In early 2005, after the assassination of Lebanon's former Prime Minister Rafik al-Hariri, Assad, under pressure from Western and Arab nations, committed to the removal of Syrian troops and intelligence services from Lebanon, where Syrian forces had been stationed since the 1976 military intervention. Although a United Nations investigation appeared to indicate some level of Syrian participation in the assassination of Hariri, the involvement of the Assad administration was not conclusively determined. Beginning in March 2011, Assad faced a significant challenge to his rule when anti-government protests broke out in Syria, inspired by a wave of pro-democracy uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. While Syrian security forces used lethal force against demonstrators, Assad offered a variety of concessions, first shuffling his cabinet and then announcing that he would seek to abolish Syria's emergency law and its Supreme State Security Court, both of which were used to suppress political opposition. However, implementation of those reforms coincided with a significant escalation of violence against protesters, drawing international condemnation for Assad and his government. As unrest spread to new areas of the country, government deployed tanks and troops to several cities that had become centers of protest. Amid reports of massacres and indiscriminate violence by security forces, Assad maintained that his country was the victim of an international conspiracy to instigate sectarian warfare in Syria, and that the government was engaged in combating networks of armed insurgents rather than peaceful civilian protesters. By September 2011, armed opposition groups had emerged and began to stage increasingly effective attacks against Syrian forces. Attempts at international mediation by the Arab League and the United Nations failed to achieve a ceasefire, and by mid-2012, the crisis had evolved into a full-blown civil war. In July 2012, Assad's inner circle suffered its most significant losses to date when several senior security officials were killed by a bomb inside a government building during a meeting. Among those killed were Daoud Rajiha, the Minister of Defense, and Asif Swakwat, Assad's brother-in-law and one of his closest advisors. With rebels and government troops seemingly locked in a bloody stalemate and security conditions deteriorating in Damascus, Assad's public appearances became increasingly rare and consisted mainly of staged events to rally troops and civilian supporters. International allies of Assad's regime and of the rebels each stepped up their support, raising the prospect of a regional proxy war. Efforts by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to fund and arm rebels became increasingly public in late 2012 and early 2013, while the Syrian government continued to receive weapons from Iran and the Lebanese military group Hezbollah. By late 2012, Hezbollah also had begun sending its own fighters into Syria to battle the rebels. Assad faced new calls for international military action against his government after alleged chemical weapons attacks in the suburbs of Damascus killed hundreds on August 21, 2013. The Syrian opposition accused pro-Assad forces of having carried out the attacks, but Assad denied having used chemical weapons and asserted that if such weapons had been used, rebel forces were to blame. US, Britain, and French leaders claimed to possess intelligence proving that Assad's regime had ordered the attacks, and they made it known that they were considering retaliatory strikes. Russia, China, and Iran spoke out against military action, and Assad vowed to fight what he described as Western aggression. The threat of Western military intervention was averted in September when Russia, Syria, and the United States came to an agreement to place all Syria's chemical weapons under international control. Assad's tactics against the rebels continue to withdraw international condemnation even when his forces refrained from using chemical weapons. So-called barrel bombs, improvised explosives dropped from helicopters and airplanes, were routinely used to devastating effect against military and civilian targets in rebel-held areas, even though human rights groups insisted that employment of such indiscriminate weapons constituted a war crime. As the civil war dragged on, Assad's hold on power, which at once seemed doubtful, appeared to grow stronger. The emergence of the extremist Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, in eastern Syria and western Iraq in 2013 forced some of the countries that had called for Assad's removal, including the United States, to refocus their efforts on defeating the new menace. Meanwhile, Russia, which had long provided weapons and political support to Assad, launched its own military action in Syria in 2015, bombarding rebel positions and deploying Russian ground troops in support of government forces. The intervention was largely successful. By the end of 2017, Assad's dominance in most of Syria's major cities had been re-established, and the remaining rebels had been confined to a few isolated pockets of territory. By mid-2018, those pockets had been reduced to the region of Idlib, with Turkish forces had vowed to protect from the Syrian army. Assad initially avoided a confrontation in Idlib, but advanced his forces in the spring of 2019 after Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an organization influenced by the ideology of Al-Qaeda, had become the dominant force in the region. Meanwhile, as the conflict was dying down in most of the country, Assad began implementing policies to rebuild Syria. They included projects to build infrastructure and new commercial centers, as well as efforts to attract foreign investors. One controversial measure, known as Law 10, allowed the government to seize property if its owners failed to register it. The purpose of the law was to allow the development or the redistribution of property abandoned during the war by its owners. Many critics noted that the time limit for reclaiming property would disenfranchise many displaced Syrians who simply could not return in time to reclaim their property, while enabling the government to expropriate property from its opponents and masses and give it to loyalists. In 2024, Assad's international support collapsed, and the consequence proved to be essential for his regime. Russia's ability to fight in Syria had been mitigated by its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Iran had also been weakened by conflict with Israel during the Israel-Hamas war. In October, Hezbollah was forced to withdraw its fighters from Syria as it defended its front lines against an Israeli ground invasion in Lebanon. Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire with Israel on November 26, but was too weakened to resume combat outside Lebanon. The next day, HTS launched an offensive that rapidly advanced east and southward from Idlib. Within days, the rebel group had taken control of Aleppo, one Syria's largest city and commercial center, and it soon afterward took Hama. In just 10 days' time, HTS and other rebel forces had isolated and entered Damascus, as reports surfaced that Assad had fled. Damascus was declared liberated on December 6, 2024, and thus the downfall of Bashar al-Assad of Syria.